On April 28, 1945, Hanna Reitsch flew out of Hitler's bunker, one of the last people to see the Führer alive. She'd landed in the middle of a collapsing Berlin, dodging Soviet artillery, to deliver a message that no longer mattered. Now she was leaving, carrying Hitler's final letters and the knowledge that the war was lost. Her family was already safe in the American zone, far from the Soviets she feared. They'd made it out of Silesia, crossed hundreds of miles of chaos, and reached the relative safety of Austria. The nightmare was supposed to be over, but 5 days later, every one of them was dead. Not from enemy fire, not from Soviet troops. The killer was her own father, a respected doctor who decided death was better than what might come next. And the method reveals something darker than simple panic. If you're watching videos like this, you'll want to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden stories of World War II families. The respectable Reitsches. To understand what happened on that night in May 1945, you first have to understand who these people were before the war tore everything apart. Dr. Wilhelm Reich, everyone called him Willy, was an ophthalmologist in Hirschberg, Silesia, a professional man in a professional town. He wasn't a party fanatic or a political operative. He was a doctor who treated patients and came home to his family. His wife, Emi, came from Austrian nobility and remained a devout Catholic throughout her life. Together, they raised 3 children in an atmosphere of education, discipline, and respectability. Their eldest was Kurt, who would go on to become a naval officer in the Kriegsmarine. Their youngest was Heidi, who by 1945 had married and was raising children of her own. And in the middle was Hanna, the one who would become famous, the pilot who broke records and won medals and eventually flew into Hitler's bunker during the final apocalyptic days of the Reich. The Reitsches were exactly the kind of family you'd expect to survive the war's end better than most. Educated, connected, resourceful. They weren't SS officers or concentration camp guards. They were the German bourgeoisie, the professional class that kept the country running regardless of who sat in Berlin. When the war ended, families like theirs were supposed to pick up the pieces and rebuild. That's not what happened. The flight west. By January 1945, the Red Army was grinding westward through Poland and into the German heartland. Silesia, where the Reitsches had lived their entire lives, lay directly in the path of the Soviet advance. What followed was one of the largest mass movements of people in human history. Millions of German civilians fled west in the brutal winter of 1944–45. They moved by foot, by cart, by any vehicle that still had fuel. The roads were clogged with refugees, and Soviet forces were never far behind. Stories spread through the columns. Stories of what happened to Germans who didn't escape in time. Rape, murder, deportation to labor camps in Siberia. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, they were believed. And belief was enough to keep people moving through snow and ice, abandoning everything they'd built. The Reich family joined this exodus. Dr. Willy, his wife Emi, their daughter Heidi, and Heidi's 3 young children, Hans-Jürgen, Ellen and Björn, all under 10 years old, made the journey west. Hundreds of miles through a collapsing country, past burned villages and abandoned military equipment, past the bodies of those who hadn't made it. They reached the Salzburg region in Austria, deep in what would become the American occupation zone. By every reasonable measure, they had escaped. The Soviets would never reach them there. The family had survived the most dangerous phase of the war's end, but the psychological terror followed them west, and it would prove more deadly than any Soviet soldier. The rumour that killed a family. In the chaos of April and May 1945, information was unreliable. Rumours spread through the refugee camps like fire through dry grass. Some were true, some were exaggerated, some were completely fabricated. But in the absence of official news, rumours were all anyone had. One rumour in particular began circulating among the Silesian refugees. The Americans were going to forcibly repatriate all of them back east, into Soviet hands. The Western Allies had made agreements with Stalin. Silesia was going to be Polish territory now, and the refugees who had fled from there would be sent back, delivered directly to the enemy they'd spent months escaping. We don't know if this rumour was accurate. Forced repatriation did occur in some cases. Soviet POWs and citizens were sometimes handed over despite their protests. But wholesale deportation of German civilians from the American zone back to Soviet territory? The historical record is unclear. What's certain is that Dr. Wilhelm Reich believed it. And for a man who had spent months absorbing horror stories about Soviet occupation, the mass rapes in East Prussia, the executions, the cattle cars heading to Siberia, belief was enough. He had brought his family hundreds of miles to safety. Now he was convinced that safety was an illusion. The Americans would hand them over. The Soviets would do what the Soviets did. Everything he'd sacrificed to protect his wife, his daughter, and his grandchildren would amount to nothing. On the night of May 3rd, 1945, 3 days after Hitler shot himself in Berlin, 5 days before Germany's official surrender, Dr. Wilhelm Reich made a decision that would destroy his family forever. A father's final act. The exact sequence of events that night remains somewhat unclear, pieced together from later investigations and the physical evidence left behind. But the broad outline is horrifying in its deliberateness. Some accounts suggest Dr. Reich first tried poison. When that proved uncertain, when it didn't work quickly enough, or completely enough, he moved to a more direct method. Room by room through their refugee lodging, a pistol in his hand, his wife Emmy, his daughter Heidi, then the children, Hans-Jürgen, Ellen, and Björn. 3 grandchildren under 10 years old, killed by the man who was supposed to protect them from exactly this kind of violence. Then himself. 6 bodies in a refugee lodging in the American zone, killed not by enemy soldiers, not by bombs or artillery, but by a 70-year-old ophthalmologist who convinced himself that death was the only protection left to offer. The war was effectively over. Germany had lost. The killing was supposed to stop. Instead, Dr. Wilhelm Reich became one of its final perpetrators. The murders happened in what should have been sanctuary. The American zone was the place refugees fled to, not from. Thousands of families in identical circumstances survived those same weeks and went on to rebuild their lives in post-war Germany. The Reiches could have been among them. Instead, they became a footnote to the regime's collapse, another family consumed by the Nazi death before dishonor mentality that had already claimed millions. The pilot in custody. While her family was dying in Austria, Hanna Reitsch was in American custody in Bavaria. She'd been captured shortly after flying out of Berlin, and now she was being interrogated about the bunker, about Hitler's final hours, about the conversations she'd witnessed, about the regime's desperate last acts. The Americans found her a useful source. She had been present for things almost no one else had survived. She'd spoken with Hitler, with Goebbels, with Magda Goebbels, and the children who would soon be murdered by their own mother. She'd carried letters out of the bunker. She was, quite literally, a witness to history's end. At some point during this interrogation, she was told the news. Her parents were dead. Her sister was dead. Her nieces and nephews were dead. All of them killed not by the Soviets she feared, not by the advancing armies, but by her own father. Sources describe her reaction as devastated. "In misery," one report noted. The famous pilot, the Iron Cross recipient, the woman who had shaken Hitler's hand in the bunker, reduced to grief by news from the American zone. But here's the bitter irony that makes this story something more than just another wartime tragedy. Hanna Reitsch had wanted to die in that bunker. She begged to stay when the order came to leave. She later described it as the blackest day of her life. Not the day her family died, but the day she was denied the chance to die at Hitler's side. She had looked at the collapsing Reich and seen honour in sharing its destruction. She survived against her will. Her family died because they wanted to live. Fanatical survivor. This is the central tension that makes the Reich family story so difficult to process. The most dangerous Nazi among them, the one who flew test missions for Hitler, who visited the bunker, who remained defiantly loyal to National Socialism until her dying day, is the only sibling who survived the war. Hanna Reitsch was a true believer, not a reluctant participant, not someone swept up in circumstances, but a devoted adherent of the regime. She wore her Iron Cross with pride for the rest of her life. She defended Hitler in interviews decades after his death. She embodied the fanaticism that had driven Germany to destruction. Her mother was a devout Catholic who had nothing to do with the regime's crimes. Her sister Heidi was raising young children, focused on family rather than politics. The grandchildren, Hans-Jürgen, Ellen and Björn, were innocent by any definition. None of them had flown for Hitler. None of them had received medals from Nazi leadership. None of them had begged to share in the regime's final destruction. Yet they were the ones who died. And Hanna, who wanted death, who sought it, who romanticized it, lived another 34 years. The question the story forces us to ask is uncomfortable. Was Dr. Reitsch's act really about protecting his family from the Soviets? Or was it the final expression of the same ideology his famous daughter embodied? The Nazi cult of death before dishonor, the belief that surrender was worse than annihilation, the conviction that a German should never submit to the enemy. These ideas had been drilled into the population for 12 years. Dr. Reitsch may have absorbed them more deeply than anyone realized. He killed his family to save them. That's the story he would have told himself. But the Soviets were never coming. The Americans weren't going to hand them over. The danger existed only in his mind. A mind shaped by years of propaganda about what awaited Germans who fell into enemy hands. The brother nobody mentions. There was a third Reich sibling, and his story is defined almost entirely by silence. Kurt Reich, Hanna's older brother, served as a frigate captain in the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. He survived the war entirely, while his parents and sister and nieces and nephews were dying in Austria, while Hanna was being interrogated about the bunker. Kurt was somewhere in the collapsing naval infrastructure of the Reich, waiting out the end like thousands of other officers. After the war, he settled in Hamburg. He lived there quietly for 46 years, dying in 1991 at the age of 81. He left no memoirs, he gave no interviews, he made no public statements about his famous sister, about his father's act, about what it meant to carry the Reich name after May 1945. What did he think of Hanna's unrepentant Nazism, of the interviews where she defended Hitler, of the Iron Cross she wore to meet John F. Kennedy? We don't know. He never said. The silent survivor, choosing to live out his years without engaging with the history that had consumed his family. Perhaps that was the only sane response. Perhaps there was nothing to say that would have made any of it make sense. The afterlife of a true believer. Hanna Reitsch spent 15 to 18 months in American custody before finally being released. She had answered their questions about the bunker, provided her account of Hitler's final days, and served whatever intelligence purpose she could serve. Then they let her go, and she resumed living. She went back to flying, gliders mostly, the aircraft she'd first fallen in love with as a young woman. She set new records. She competed internationally. She became an aviation advisor to the government of Ghana, of all places, helping establish their gliding program. The most famous female pilot in Nazi Germany, now teaching Africans to fly. In 1961, she visited the United States and met President John F. Kennedy at the White House. The photos from that visit show her wearing her Iron Cross, the medal Hitler had personally awarded her for test flying the V-1 flying bomb. Kennedy apparently found her charming. He didn't know, or didn't care, that she remained an unrepentant defender of the regime his country had helped destroy. Throughout the post-war decades, Hanna gave interviews defending Hitler. She described him as kind, as gentle, as misunderstood. She insisted that the Holocaust wasn't his fault, that he had been surrounded by bad advisors, that he didn't know what was being done in his name. This was denial on a spectacular scale. but she maintained it until the end. Hanna Reitsch died on August 24, 1979, officially of a heart attack. She was 67 years old, but a letter she wrote to a friend shortly before her death has fueled decades of speculation. "It began in the bunker," she wrote, "there it shall end." Some historians interpret this as evidence of suicide, a final act connecting her death to the place she had wanted to die 34 years earlier. Others see it simply as the dramatic language of a woman who had always been theatrical about her Nazi convictions. She was buried in Salzburg, not far from where her family had died. The pilot who escaped the bunker, finally at rest near the people she couldn't save. The questions that remain. The Reich family story ends with uncertainties that may never be resolved. Genealogical records suggest Heidi may have had more than 3 children, possibly some who weren't with her on the night of May 3, 1945. Did anyone else survive? We can't say for certain. The records conflict, the witnesses are dead, and the chaos of that period makes documentation unreliable. What we know is this: the Reich family line effectively ended in a refugee lodging in the American zone in the first week of May 1945. Killed not by Soviet soldiers, not by Allied bombers, not by the violence that had consumed Europe for 6 years. Killed by a rumour, killed by fear, killed by a father who convinced himself that murder was mercy. The enemy never came. The danger was imaginary. 6 people died because of what might happen, not what actually did. And the one family member most aligned with the ideology that created such fear? She lived another 3 decades, defended Hitler to the end, and died an old woman in her bed. Sometimes history offers no moral. Sometimes the story is simply the story, brutal, ironic, and unresolved. The Reich family gave us one pilot who became famous and one doctor who became a murderer. Both believed they were doing the right thing. Both were wrong. Thanks for watching History Hangover. If you found this video insightful, check out our other deep dives into the families of the Third Reich and what became of them after the war. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.